Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What event felt normal at the time, but ended up haunting you to this day? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. This was longer than I thought it'd be. TLDR, at the bottom. My mom has epilepsy. It's totally under control with medication, and she hasn't had a seizure in years. Anyway, when we were little, she always told my siblings and I what to do in case she had one. Seizures can cause temporary memory loss, so we would answer her questions when she came to, time her seizures, things like that. My dad died a month or so before my 12th birthday, and her doctor prescribed an antidepressant temporarily and told her if it interfered with her current medications, they'd need to change the dosage. She could always feel them coming on, and one day when we were home together, she called me into her room because she was about to have one. When she came to, she was confused as usual and asked questions. What day it was, what time it was, how long was the seizure. Then she asked a question that I wasn't sure how to answer, but thought it best to be honest. She asked where my dad was. I was still grieving. This was probably a month to 6 weeks after he died, so it made me cry. But I remember the exact words I said, "Mom, Dad died." I had to break the news to my mom that her husband of 14 years was dead, as if it was the first time. She immediately started sobbing, asking what happened and when it happened. Was I okay? Where were my siblings? Were they okay? I'm tearing up just thinking about it. It broke my heart, and I never want to break news like that to her again. She only had one seizure after that, and they figured out the balance of her meds. When she asked where my dad was, I just told her he was at work. She slowly remembered what happened, and it was a much less painful experience for both of us. TLDR. 12-year-old kid has to break the death of father to epileptic mother due to temporary memory loss after a seizure. Thank you for sharing that story. That's a rough situation to be in, but your mom was proactive with her condition, and hope you guys got better, man. Thanks. When I was about 12, we got some new neighbors. They had a huge family with a couple kids my age and this one guy, I'd say in his late 20s. We had a pool in our backyard that I would often swim in. The guy would sometimes shout at me while I was in the pool, asking me to bring his basketball back because it would wound up in our yard. He didn't speak much English, so was hard to understand. Oftentimes, he would stare at me while I was outside, and he would even bring a chair over to the fence and watch me swim. I never thought anything of it. My grandma and stepdad would occasionally do that when the younger children played in the pool. He would also sing to me when I was outside. I always felt like an outcast with my family, so I was happy that someone was paying attention to me. Years later, I'm visiting my parents' house with my younger cousin who is 10. She's swimming in the pool, and I step out to tell her lunch is ready, when I see the same creep walking over to the fence with the basketball in his hand and watch him casually toss the ball over the fence while my cousin's back is turned, and then he started shouting at her for the ball back. I shut that down real fast. Parents put a privacy fence up that next week. At the restaurant where I used to work, there were a group of us who always closed together. Once the restaurant locked its doors for the night, we would all go back out and smoke and bullshit for a little while. Then we'd all go back inside and work together to knock out the closing duties so that we could leave for the night. One night, one of the girls, who was a single mother of 2 young children and a notorious partier, just kind of started talking to no one in particular, just kind of thinking out loud. She said, "I had the weirdest dream last night. I dreamt that I woke up and there were these people standing around my bed, and they told me that I had one more chance. But if I didn't stop partying, they were going to take my kids away and give them to someone else to raise." She just kind of shivered, and no one really responded. She died of an overdose a week later. That was over 20 years ago, but I still think about it often. I was at a family thing, and my aunt had brought her new boyfriend. He had apparently been in the Mexican military and had also done bodyguard jobs for important people down there, so I was fascinated by this. I showed him some of my guns and tried to learn some kind of warrior knowledge off him. After some pestering, he finally said, "Okay, let's say you were bodyguarding for your aunt. Where would you look for a threat?" We were standing outside. I looked around as best I could and said something like, "Well, there could be like someone hiding in one of the parked cars. Duck down." He chuckled and was like, "No. What about someone on the inside? Someone at this very party? The threat usually isn't from the outside, some stranger. The threat usually comes from within, from someone you thought you could trust." 6 months later, I found out he was arrested and deported back to Mexico for conspiring to murder my aunt to get $40,000 somehow. Looking back on that conversation now is effing terrifying. My dad and his male relatives, including my grandfather, would always make really sexual comments and jokes around me and my female cousins. I assumed this was normal. As we got older, it got worse. I got used to putting my hands over my backside to keep my skirt down so they couldn't put their hand up there. What? I felt so guilty because when I would tell them not to touch me, they would get so angry and defensive and make it seem like I was the one in the wrong for being uncomfortable and turning a joke into something gross. It took a lot to get over that. Good. I can't be the only one asking, what about the older females in the family? How could they put up with that or let you be subjected to that? It's horrible. Sorry. Not sorry. Whenever we had family or guests come over when I was young, elementary school, I would dress up a bit nicer, so I'd usually end up wearing a skirt. One time, my mom's brother was coming over, and she said, if he asks to look up your skirt, tell him no. I didn't understand why someone would ask to do that or why that was a bad thing. As I got older, I realized what it was about. It made me look at him a little differently. When I noticed my dad still hadn't grabbed his usual 2 cups of ramen off the counter, he's very particular about grabbing and eating his cups as soon as the hot waters cook them. But it had been over an hour, and they were still sitting there. I didn't think much of it at the time and continued whatever I was doing. Probably 15 minutes later, I get a text from my stepmom telling me to go check on my dad in his room. She just received a text from him that he couldn't breathe. He had a hard headache, and he couldn't get up from his bed. Long story short, he was rushed to the hospital, and we later found out he had had a stroke. If I hadn't called the paramedics when I did, he might have been treated too late and died. I still vividly remember my dad being in the hospital that night, the whole family being too terrified to sleep, and his 2 cups of ramen still on the counter. Almost being abducted as a child, 5-year-old, on vacation, at the pool with my mom and aunt. I forget why they weren't around, this is 20 years ago now, and a random guy gets in the pool, probably in his 30s, talk for a couple of minutes, and he invited me to play basketball with him later. And obviously I wanted to play. My mom and aunt come back, and I tell them I'm playing basketball with my new friend later and point at the guy. They pull me out of the pool, and we go back to the hotel rooms, then left the next day. Didn't hit me until I was like 18 that he was a pedo. In my state, we have a huge problem with wrong-way drivers crashing into people on the freeways. I came across one of those accidents right after it happened. I immediately parked behind it and started to help in any way I could until EMS and the highway patrol arrived. Once they got there, I got back in my car and went home like everything was normal. I still think about it to this day, and it was probably 10 to 11 years ago. The female driver of the car going the correct way died on impact and was slumped over in her seat. The female in the passenger seat was crushed, could only see part of her leg and part of her head. You could tell she was still breathing. I don't know how she was still alive at that point. I found out later they used the jaws of life to cut her out of the car, but she died on the way to the hospital. Of course, the drunk guy going the wrong way lived, like they always seem to do. I was 9, and my mom and I had just gotten back from a long car trip. It was around 6 or 7 p.m. and starting to get dark. I was going through this phase where I loved playing basketball and just wanted to shoot hoops to decompress from a long day. My mom let me play basketball by myself in the front driveway for a bit before I had to start getting ready for bed. While I was playing, there was this old beat-up car that drove on my street. When it would pass my driveway, it would slow down. I couldn't see the driver because the windows were dark. The car kept circling back to my house, slowing down each time it passed my driveway, then speed up again. After the 3rd time, I saw it disappear from sight. I ran inside and went to my front window. I waited until the car came back a few minutes later. It slowed down as usual, right by my house. When it saw I wasn't in the front yard, it sped away a lot faster than normal. I waited a few more minutes to see if it would come back, but it didn't. I didn't tell my mom at the time what happened, but thinking back, it haunts me to consider what would have happened if I didn't go inside. My mother homeschooled me for most of the first half of my school years. She was awful, resorting to beating me and screaming if I had trouble understanding a question or lesson. She also would constantly remind my brother and I of bizarre sins we could be committing, such as playing violent video games or watching cartoons where the characters had fake voices, or talking to girls when you get to high school because dating should only lead to marriage. Later on in life, she started canning tons of food and making plans on what nearby reservoirs provide the best water. It wasn't until my adult years that I realized she was effing a religious nut that was afraid they weren't teaching enough about God in school, and it pissed her off, and believed Obama was the Antichrist and Illuminati figure who will destroy the world's economy. Now as an adult, I live with personal shame of my childhood, anxiety, and find myself confused about my faith and perception of life. I struggle in college and have had a hard time socializing, and it honestly depresses me to the point where I lock myself in my car and weep. It gets better. In high school, our career guidance counselor always had this gang of boys, usually in the younger years, hanging out with him. The boys changed, but the little gang of teen males always around him never did. He was no help to the girls, and we all just accepted that. He'd pull his chosen ones out of class for things. I played in the same hockey club as one of the boys at one stage, and he would turn up at our games to watch. This is Australia. We aren't talking school hockey, we're talking a completely separate club that was in no way affiliated with the school, and we were the only two kids with crossover. He even turned up at regional championship tournaments that was about 3-hour drive and a weekend away. We all kind of just knew that there was something weird going on, and that was that. Looking back as an adult, it makes me feel sick to the stomach. What didn't the parents tell him to piss off? Why didn't the other teachers put a stop to it? My mom would allude to it, but what the F? In high school, my house was the accidental target of a drive-by. Our next-door neighbor was a small-time drug dealer, and I guess he pissed off the wrong people. I was on the phone with a friend when it happened and just moved behind a doorframe and kept talking. Our house was brick, so nobody got hurt, but they did hit the driver's door of my mom's SUV. The one bullet that hit the intended house entered through a downstairs window and struck a wall directly above a crib where a baby was sleeping. The drug dealer's house was a duplex, and he lived upstairs. The family downstairs were just renting and had no connection to him at all. My friend liked to joke that I was a stone-cold badass, but the truth was that I was simply used to the sound of gunshots in my part of town and hadn't really processed what had happened until much later. I still think about that bullet hole above the crib and how much worse it could have been had the shooter aimed slightly lower while randomly firing. Had a male orthodontist who was a good family friend. I was 13 years old. When laid back in his dental chair, he always found the opportunity to rest one of his hands on my crotch. He would move his hand around just a little bit while looking at my teeth. It wasn't anything accidental because it happened at absolutely every single visit. I was just too young to figure it out at the time. I know that may sound lame, but it's true. He was an effing disgusting pedophile. He was married to a great gal, and they were close friends of my parents. To top it off, we were neighbors, and he was a deacon in our church. Later on, I talked to other kids who had the same experience with this pervert. This was over 50 years ago. I sincerely hope that kids today are a lot more savvy about sexual predators. I would venture to guess that today's youth, like under 20, are definitely more savvy when it comes to it. Maybe it's the internet, for whatever reason, but I think that I was naive to a lot of things that even my 8-year-old now is aware of. How about you? We had a house on our block go through a lot of families moving in and out. Recently, a new family moved in and got to know our neighborhood really well. My dad, carpenter, did a couple little jobs on their house, like fix the front door, etc. Well, come to find out, they had a high danger warrant for drugs, so the sheriff blocked the street and raided the house. My brothers calling me names and being mean growing up. They called me ugly, stupid, and useless, and often told me to just go kill myself, nobody wants you around, etc. My parents had 5 kids and worked all the time to support the family, so most of my social interactions were with my siblings. School was no better. I was weird and bullied by my siblings and their friends. To this day, I have huge issues with suicide and have attempted to kill myself multiple times. The first attempt was when I was 7 years old. I have a lot of issues with any type of relationship because I can't trust anyone or what they say about me because I feel like a burden they're trying to get rid of. Those words haunt me every day and still haunt me. I hope you get help. Sorry.